All right, so here's how the Q&A segment is going to proceed. The first part is going to be questions and answers that Farhan takes from the Google Forms that he is currently viewing right now. And after he's done with that, if there are any more questions that you would like to have, you can just ask them by raising your hand, and we'll unmute you so that you can ask the question directly on this call. All right? So we're going to move on to the first part first. So Farhan?
Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, so I'm just gonna go through like the various questions that were asked during the lecture. So I've broken it up to several categories. So let's just look at the first one, which is questions relating to policy. So there was a question that asked what to do if the team cannot agree on a policy to run. And I think the first thing you need to ask yourself as to why there are some disagreements is to just question like what exactly is the disagreement about. Because if the disagreement is about what type of policy you want to set, there are obviously like a varying scales of policies within any debate round. So within a debate, there's something known as like a soft line policy and like a hard line policy. So if you think about policies on a spectrum or the type of policies, it exists on a spectrum. So the soft line being an extreme end of one side of the policy, and a hard line being on the other extreme end of the spectrum of what a policy could look like. So I think I just want to give an example of what exactly I mean by this. So let's just assume that we're doing a debate motion about legalizing euthanasia. If you are a team that's defending a very soft policy, your policy is probably going to be very restrictive in terms of who can access the tool of euthanasia. So for those who don't know what euthanasia is, euthanasia just means assisted suicide, typically conducted by the state authorities. So if you're running a soft line policy with regards to legalizing euthanasia, you would probably have several tiers. So for instance, like you would probably only allow individuals who are suffering from terminal illnesses, so maybe let's say less than 3 months of life, to gain access to assisted suicide. You probably would have a tier of a policy that suggests that this person must be mentally sound and mentally capable when he makes the decision to engage in euthanasia. You would probably also have a tier of that model that suggests that mental suffering is not the same equivalent of a physical suffering. And therefore, even if you suffer from like bouts of depression, you probably cannot gain access to euthanasia as an option, as opposed to someone who's, let's say, suffering from like terminal cancer. So that's probably a very soft line policy because you're restricting it to a very select group of individuals who can use euthanasia as an option. A hardline policy of what euthanasia would look like would probably be a team that defends allowing any and every individual to use euthanasia at any parts of their life, without taking into consideration whether they actually have a terminal illness or not. So let's say this individual lost his job, he's now depressed, and he wants to engage in euthanasia. You probably would defend that in a hardline model. So you would defend that the individual can gain access to euthanasia even if it's not suffering from a terminal illness, as long as the person subjectively determines for himself that his quality of life is no longer meaningful, he can access euthanasia. So what I've just demonstrated is just like really soft policy, like a really soft policy with regards to who can use euthanasia, and a really hardline policy as to who can use euthanasia. So there might be a disagreement as to which policy do you want to defend. Do you want to defend a very soft policy, or you want to defend a very hardline policy? Usually what most teams will do is that they'll defend somewhere in the middle. So like a policy that is not super hardline, but it's also not super soft, but it's typically leaning towards more hardline. And the reason for that is because like if you have a policy that's right smack in the center, or like center right towards the hardline stance, that policy is often more reasonable within the realm, as well as the fact that it's more principally consistent with what you're defending. So let's say if like proposition runs the idea that individuals should have the freedom of choice and that the state should not dictate for themselves how they should live their lives, but you decide to run an incredibly soft policy where only a very small group of individuals have access to euthanasia, you would run the risk of being principally inconsistent. So like your argument of freedom of choice doesn't apply at the point where you run an incredibly restrictive an incredibly restrictive policy. So if the disagreement is with regards to whether you want to run a soft or hardline policy, the first thing is to maybe have a discussion as to, as a team, what are you more comfortable with defending? So obviously, if you run a soft line policy, it shields you from a lot of attacks from opposition, right? Because opposition would be like, oh, what if the person suffers from depression for like maybe 2 months, but after 2 months he's like all recovered and no longer have like symptoms of wanting to kill himself? Then like what do you do in those instances? And that's why like the softer your policy is on like proposition, the easier it is for you to defend against such kind of like quibbles coming up from opposition. But the more soft line you go into, it's likely that any principal arguments that you're forwarding is just unlikely to take root within the round. So you need to ask as a team, like, what are you all willing to defend? Are you comfortable with defending that any and every individual can use euthanasia, regardless of what the reasons are? And if the answer is yes, then like stick to that particular version of that policy that you're willing to defend. But let's say there are some individuals that are uncomfortable with defending that, then you must ask the team whether they're more like comfortable in defending the soft line. At the end of the day, right, if let's say there's still disagreements as to whether you want to run a soft policy or a hard policy, or what manifestation of that policy is, thankfully in like nationals or like SSSDC, it's a five-person team. Worst case scenario, you go down into a democratic vote. If the majority votes on, let's say, a soft line policy, then I think everyone just needs to be on the same page and defend that soft line version of that policy. So that's with regards to, what do you do if you cannot agree on a policy to run? There's also a question about, is it always required to include an alternative solution in your policy? And then I think this depends, but at the secondary school level, if you're opposition, there's no burden on you to prove why the alternative would work or why the alternative would succeed. On like general judging conventions, opposition just needs to prove why proposition's policy, let's say this house would ban smoking, or let's say this house would ban the consumption of drugs. As long as opposition proves why the act of banning like X product results in more harms, opposition can win. So to answer that question, it's not always necessary to include an alternative solution in your policy, because the judging conventions don't require for you to do so. But if you are able to include an alternative solution in your policy, you basically would widen the gap between you and your opponents, because not only do you prove why their case results in more harms, you're also able to prove an alternative measure or an alternative solution in resolving the very same problems that they have identified. So you would want to do it if you want to widen the score gap between you and your opponents, but it's not necessary for you to it's not always necessary for you to include an alternative solution. So this hopefully answers both questions with regards to policy. So the next part of the questions, or next category of questions I want to answer, is with regards to questions relating to brainstorming. The first question that I got, which I think is quite good, is how do we brainstorm different angles to focus on for the motion? And I think there are several ways to which you can do this. The first way to which you want to brainstorm different angles is perhaps to consider the different stakeholders that are involved within the motion. So within the motion, it's not like solely confined towards like two actors. It could potentially like involve like other stakeholders or other actors. So in the earlier example, we had this motion about this house will abolish single-sex schools. So obviously, like, you want to consider the various stakeholders that are involved in this motion. So for instance, the individual students who are enrolled in single-sex schools right now, you could also consider stakeholders like that would include the teachers, for example. So how are teachers affected when they now transition from a single-sex school environment to, let's say, a mixed school environment? So this is with regards to like teachers who have been teaching in a single-sex school for like an extended period of time, or perhaps for their whole lives. Like, why is it significantly better when they are now moved to a mixed school environment? Perhaps you can say that like some teachers who have been teaching for a really long time in a single-sex school environment have certain preconceived notions or understanding as to how that particular sex ought to behave. So like, for instance, like, within like a single sex school, like, so let's say like an all girls school, like teachers will always complain like if girls are not seated correctly, if their skirts are too short, if they are perhaps behaving too manly. So you could even say that like if you look at the stakeholder of teachers, you could say that we improve the quality of teaching significantly, or that we could improve or the fact that we could remove certain like gender stereotypes or gender biases that the teachers may have, given that they have taught in a single sex school for an extended period of time. So thinking of the different stakeholders are very useful within a round. So look at the individual, look at the society, the people that are related to the individual. So on the motion about, let's say, legalizing euthanasia, you would obviously take into consideration the person who wants to engage in euthanasia. But if you want to think of a different angle with regards to the motion, you could perhaps think of how would the family members of the person deciding to take euthanasia feel about the entire process. So let's say person X wants to engage in assisted suicide, but the family of person X is very resistant and very upset that person X would even consider assisted suicide. So you obviously can run some arguments there to say that maybe the family's sentiments or wishes ought to be a point of consideration when we discuss whether euthanasia should be a tool to even like be implemented to begin with. So in that instance, you're looking at stakeholders as just not the individual alone that's highlighted in the motion. You could also look at like broader entities. So like you could look at corporations, you could look at, let's say, different social movements, you could look at government entities, you can look at like broadly like how does this affect society as well. So that's just like different ways to which you can brainstorm different angles when it comes to any motion. You could also not just think of it in stakeholders, you can think of it in terms of like consequences and effects. So like obviously there are some arguments that prove why in the short term you would gain X amount of benefits, but in the long term we gain X amount of benefits as well. So let's say with regards to, let's say it's a motion about defending political parties over social movements in forwarding progressive rights. A proposition that's defending, let's say, the political party would say that we could perhaps try to make short-term gains as quickly as possible, because policies have a very real effect on the lives of individuals. But you could also think of it in the long term, right? So in the short term, you might be able to create policies as a political party to resolve the problems that people might have. But you can also explain in the long term why this is a good thing when political parties engage in forwarding such policies. So the fact that is maybe like, maybe for instance, you could argue that laws play a very important role in society, and people oftentimes formulate their own decision-making calculus based on the laws that exist within your own like country. So for instance, like countries that perhaps have laws that are discriminatory towards African American, as a country, when you see such laws, you're likely to believe that discrimination against African Americans is possibly justified. So that's the long-term change that you garner under proposition if you prove that you can achieve some degree of policy changes as a politician. So that's another way to which you can brainstorm. Like, don't just think of it in stakeholders, like in terms of stakeholders, you can look at it in terms of consequences and effects, like both short-term, long-term, and how exactly, like, what are the kind of benefits you can accrue both in both time frame. The other question that we had was about whether there are any tips to lead one to a best question to start brainstorming for an argument, rather than endlessly brainstorming on questions. So I think like if you want a very easy answer to that, I think like the best question to always ask yourself when you see a motion is just, what is the problem in this debate that requires a resolution or requires me to formulate a solution? And that's probably one of the best way to think of an argument in any round, basically. Because most debates, as I earlier mentioned in the lecture, would always have a problem. And your job in the round, basically, is to provide a solution to that problem. So hopefully that answers your question. But I do think maybe in training rounds or like training practices, the endless brainstorming on questions might be more useful first, because it comes with experience. The more you brainstorm like different types of questions, not only would it make your case like a lot more coherent and cohesive, but eventually when you get more experience in asking questions, you would typically jump to the best questions eventually. So in the starting out process, it's a bit slow when you're just brainstorming of as many questions as possible. But as you gain more experience as a debater, you will eventually be able to jump straight to what the best question is within the round. Another question about whether do I prefer to brainstorm more positively or negatively. I don't technically have a preference. I think both are okay. But if I have to choose a preference, I would say that my preference is to prove a positive case. So like I generally enjoy thinking of arguments or creating a case to prove why my case wins the debate as opposed to why my opponents lose the round. Um, so for example, on a motion which talks about banning drug consumption or smoking or any kind of like social vices, on opposition, I would spend a considerable amount of time to explain why under our side, we have a solution or we have an alternative that can mitigate the problems of those vices that proposition talks about without having to resort to a ban. And the reason why I generally enjoy coming up with a positive case or brainstorming more positively is because I think that demonstrates your ability as a debater to be a lot more charitable in engaging the problem that proposition sets up as well. Because you could potentially face a proposition that says that the problem is very disastrous right now and that at least they are trying to do something as opposed to an opposition that's not doing anything whatsoever. So let's say you have a motion about supporting climate change, right? Or supporting climate policies or environmental protection policies over economic-based policies. And let's say proposition like builds the entire debate saying why the environment is essentially going into a doomsday scenario right now, and that many people are losing their lives because of like erratic weather patterns or like erratic environmental devastation that has like wreaked havoc on like human population. An opposition that attempts to deny the problem or tries to move away from the problem probably wouldn't do very well, especially if Gov can prove an imperative within the round to say that the problem is as bad or is as disastrous as we claim that necessitates our model, and at least our policy can achieve some benefits as opposed to not having any benefits whatsoever from opposition. So like usually I'll spend some time thinking about how do I brainstorm more positively and coming up with an argument that's more effective. I had a question about, what if we are dealt with an extremely foreign and difficult motion, and what are we supposed to do? What then are we supposed to do in an impromptu round? And in all honesty, if at the secondary school level, one is that they rarely will have extremely foreign and difficult motions in like a secondary school level of debating. So it's just unlikely that you will get an impromptu round in a secondary school tournament that's asking you to perhaps defend United States geopolitical interests within the Middle East. Like it's just highly unlikely that you will get motions like that. So it means that if you get motions like that, you're probably not at a secondary school tournament. You're probably debating at a university tournament or even like a junior college tournament. And in those instances, like there's nothing else that I can advise you beyond saying that you should have read a little bit more before entering such a tournament, because those tournaments are packed at the higher levels anyway. So, but in the event you decided to be brave and you entered a university tournament to, experience what university debating is like, and you get a motion that's incredibly foreign and incredibly difficult for you, I would say go back to the basics and just ask like the simple questions, because you probably will be able to derive some answers from it. And if let's say you cannot answer the questions, my suggestion is that for secondary school teams, it's quite useful for you to buy an almanac. So like, ask your teachers to perhaps like purchase or invest in an almanac. It'll probably be useful in most debating tournaments. In case those who don't know what an almanac is basically a very big book that lists down different statistics from different countries. So like they have like an entire like portfolio of like different countries from America all the way to like Zimbabwe. And like they have like different statistical facts that you can derive from reading through the almanac. So if you're going to like if you're going to like a university or a junior college tournament and like you are expecting foreign and difficult motions, just bring an almanac. It'll probably help you quite a significant bit. How much time are we supposed to spend on preempting and thinking of opposition's argument and impromptu rounds? I got a couple of questions on this. My suggestion is, my answer to this is that any strong case that is done right would naturally preempt what your opponents will have to say. So you don't have to spend you don't have to dictate a specific time slot or allocate a specific amount of time to think of what your opponents would run. Because if you look at the way that the lecture is conducted, when you ask those questions, right, about different motions, you're naturally preempting what your opposition is already saying. So, for instance, when we talk about the abolishing single-sex schools, and you ask a question which is, do we abolish single-sex schools immediately, or do we do it over a period of an extended period? That question would allow you to preempt any opposition quibble right from the start. Because if opposition says you abolish it immediately would result in very disruptive practices being changed, and this hurts students, you would already preempt that when you ask yourself, how long do you want to take just to abolish single-sex schools? So I would say it's a natural process. It's not necessarily a process that is a hard and fast rule. But assuming you really want to spend some time just preempting what your opposition is thinking about, my answer is perhaps spend maybe 5 minutes to think about it. Because at the end of the day, a preemption is only as effective as how strong the rest of your positive case is. And if the rest of your positive case isn't well built up, you preempting the argument makes very little, or there's very little benefit for you to do that, as opposed to just running a good case under your side. Then I have a couple of questions about what is the third speaker supposed to do during prep, since they can't work on arguments, or do we prepare rebuttals during prep time? So with regards to what third speakers are supposed to do, I think the preemption is basically what the third speaker does. So the third speaker spends the bulk of prep time thinking about what are my opponents going to run, and one, does our case necessarily resolve the problems or the arguments that opposition would run? And two is obviously thinking about how do you win the deadlocks that will arise in certain clashes or certain rebuttals that your opponents would launch at you. I don't think the third speaker just sits there and do nothing. Besides that, you can also get the third speaker to help with, let's say, developing and thinking about the second speaker argument. Because if all of the strongest arguments go into your first speaker, your second speaker would probably be fumbling around and going oh no, what do I run for a second speaker argument? And I think that's where the third speaker could spend some time just discussing with the second speaker, what the second speaker argument is. And this also allows the third speaker to be aware as to what they're going to defend afterwards. With regards to the question about do we prepare rebuttals during prep time, I think this depends on your level of debating and in terms of how experienced you are. Generally, I'm not a fan of coming up with rebuttal sheets in advance, and the reason for it is because once you have a rebuttal sheet, you kind of tend to over rely on that rebuttal sheet as a means of responding to whatever your opponents say. And the problem is there are a couple of instances where your rebuttal sheet might not actually respond towards a specific nuance in your opponent's case, but you don't take note of it because you're oh, I already have a rebuttal sheet prepared during prep time, and therefore I want to use it. And this might actually result in your response being misrepresentative of what your opponents are saying. So in general, my tip or advice is that don't rely on rebuttal sheets too much. But let's say if you do want to have a rebuttal sheet, how you go about it is first is just questioning yourself what your opponents would run, as in terms of their big arguments. So let's say it's a motion about let's say we're doing the motion on the single-sex schools one, abolishing single-sex schools, and you know that your opposition is going to run an argument to say single-sex schools are perhaps important for certain groups of people who feel safer in an environment where it is just one sex. So for example, female students in, let's say, rural parts of India, when they're attending school, they might feel a very visible threat when they're doing classes with boys, who perhaps have a tendency to make fun of them, have a tendency to bully them, and therefore their learning is just heavily stunted if they were to go into a mixed school environment. So opposition would probably run an argument to say that single-sex schools are a necessity because it caters towards a particular demographic. In the third proposition speaker, or as a third speaker, you'll probably write down the header of their argument and spend some time thinking and prep, like how does your case arguments naturally respond to that argument of theirs, and then maybe think of like additional responses that you can pass towards your second speaker or extend within your own speech. All right, so questions relating to first speaker speech. There's a question which is, are we meant to start our speech immediately with definitions and policy? Or are there different things that we ought to include in between? So my first advice is to say that this depends on your coach and what they prefer you do within your prime minister speech or your leader of opposition speech or first op speech. So my first suggestion is to listen to your coach and listen to what they would want you to include within your first speaker speech. But assuming you don't have a coach and that's why you're asking this question, my suggestion is to say that besides, I wouldn't naturally jump into definition and policy immediately. I usually have a preamble for my first speaker speech. So for those who don't know what a preamble is just an opening statement in your speech. So, and I think this boils down a little bit into like debate psychology and strategy as well. Because at JGs, for those who intend to participate at like SSSDC or have participated in SSSDC, you would recognize or you would realize that most of the rounds would start at like 7 p.m. onwards. And if you're in the third time slot, like your round will probably start at like 9 p.m. And like, if you think about it, like judges are so exhausted because like they've listened to 2 rounds before this, it's really late at night, and now they have to listen to your speech. What I think the preamble does like uniquely for the prime minister or like the first proposition speaker or the first opposition speaker is that it basically sets the context and it sets the direction of your team's case. So think of it as an opening statement to capture the attention of the judges, and it's to basically give them something that is not too dry. So this is where your perhaps like what you learn from the style lecture from like Mr. Sam is that you want to create some sort of an illustration within the first 15 to 20 seconds of your speech to just capture the attention of your judge as well as the attention of your audience. And within your preamble, you could do a problem setup, so you could illustrate the problem really quickly. So let's say if it's a motion about defending environmental policies, like my preamble would probably spend some time in the first 20 seconds just talking about how bad the consequences of environmental devastation look like right now, and how people on the ground are directly implicated as a consequence of like erratic weather patterns, right? So the fact that you have flash floods and like homes are getting destroyed, like your farms are getting like your farms are unsustainable because of like erratic weather patterns that like have extended period of droughts. People are losing their livelihoods because of this. The fact that like there is soil erosion or like there's land erosion, and that like houses that are built atop of cliffs are like literally just falling off into the ocean. Like all these are problems that you want to illustrate in the first 15 seconds or first 20 seconds of your speech. After that, you can like very well jump into definitions and policy. If there's anything else you want to include, you probably maybe want to be very clear about what your burden of proof is. And this nicely ties into my the second question that's asked, which is, what is a burden of proof? And the burden of proof is basically what your team needs to defend conclusively or argue conclusively to win. So for example, if you have to defend a motion saying that this house will abolish the Olympics, you must explain why the harms of the Olympics are so definitive that there are no other alternatives to correcting it. So your burden in the round is not just to prove that there are harms to the Olympics. You need to prove why those harms are exclusive to hosting the Olympics and why those harms to the Olympics cannot be resolved by any other alternatives that opposition is suggesting, and that it can only be resolved when you abolish the Olympics. So that's your burden of proof within the round. And your arguments, to some extent, would be centered around defending this burden. I had a similar question, which is, what exactly is the yardstick? I think with regards to what is the yardstick, I'm unsure as to what exactly your idea of a yardstick is, but your idea of a yardstick is the same as a burden of proof. there's no fixed yardstick per se then, if your idea of a yardstick is the same as burden of proof. Um, there's no fixed yardstick in any round unless the motion explicitly calls for it, because in most rounds, there could be a variety of problems that you could potentially identify as a team. And the yardstick within the round is based on what your team decides to identify as the biggest problem, and therefore developing a solution for it. So my suggestion is that my answer to this question is that there's just no hard and fast rule to this. You determine as a team your yardstick based on what you think your team is willing to defend and what kind of problems you exactly want to resolve. All right, the last category of questions that I've received, which is are mechanisms the same as solutions, and people who don't understand what a mechanism is. A mechanism is basically the process of a solution. And I'm gonna answer this question about like premises as well, and then I'll use an example to explain both mechanisms and premises. So let's say you're doing a motion that explicitly requires you to evaluate how the climate change movement is working. Let's say the motion is the climate change movement has done more good than harm. If your proposition and you say that the climate change movement has done more good because environmental protection would result in saving more lives, the premise within the argument that you need to prove is that more lives are saved as a consequence of environmental protection. So you need to prove within your argument why the climate change movement has resulted in a net improvement of the lives of individuals, both maybe quantitatively or qualitatively. So you could perhaps say, let's say we, as a climate change movement, we managed to stop, like, let's say industries like factories or like oil industry, and this like actively reduces the kind of over pollution that's happening. Quantitatively, you save a lot of lives because like people who live near those industries generally have poorer health conditions. So like for instance in Indonesia, where they like burn like the different trees, or like when they burn the forest through like slash and burn techniques because they want to get like palm oil, like cities in Indonesia that live near like that particular problem will obviously suffer from extensive health conditions, and therefore resulting in a shorter lifespan. So you can say quantitatively we save more lives because less people are likely to get the environmental harm that is a consequence of illegal environmental practices. So more people have an extended period of or an extended duration of life, and this is like objectively a good thing. So that's maybe a quantitative evaluation. A qualitative evaluation could just say that people live better lives, people can therefore more productive, they're less likely to fall ill due to whatever environmental related like illness or like hazard, and this also objectively a good thing for people. So that's the premise that you have to prove if you want to say why environmental protection saves lives. So what then is the mechanism in the argument? So the mechanism isn't to say that the environmental movement have saved lives, because that's the end point. The end point of the argument is that you want to prove why they save lives. So the mechanism, therefore, is to explain how the environmental movement arrived at the conclusion of saving lives or protecting people from environmental harms. So for example, you could say that the environmental movement is effective in enacting policy changes in protecting the environment, and they are able to do this through measures such as, let's say, social campaigning to raise awareness, and such as engaging in like disruptive protests, so as to force the governments to enact those policies. So those two are examples of like two different mechanisms as to how you arrive at the end conclusion. But you want to explain how those mechanisms have succeeded rather than listing them in a round. So this is where the details, this is where paying keen attention to the details are really important. So let's say you are debating and you tell the judge, and I'll give you two examples. So let's say you tell the judge that environmental movement have succeeded in fighting for environmental legal protection through policies of campaigns and through policies of protests. And that's all that you say. This isn't a compelling argument, or it isn't very persuasive, because you're not explaining to the judge how the mechanisms of a protest or how a mechanism of a campaign is effective in lobbying for change. So a stronger team would explain the mechanism. So they would explain through processes of campaigning where they are able to raise the awareness of environmental harms and environmental devastation. They are able to convince and persuade ordinary laymen or individuals who are presently apathetic to understand why environmental harms have a very real consequence on them, even if they do not feel it immediately, right? And that's why when individuals now understand through processes of campaigning that the environmental concern is something that they should be concerned about as well, these individuals are more likely to go towards their member of parliament or go towards their own constituencies to ask their like representatives to surface these kind of like concerns with regards to the environment towards the government. So if you notice like the difference, right? The first one merely says that campaigns increases awareness. In the latter example or like latter illustration that I gave, I explained to you why campaigns are so effective in persuading individuals who are presently apathetic. And I explained what individuals are likely to do once they are convinced by your campaigns. So let's say protests as well. A proposition team that is not very good, or perhaps is not very good at explaining the details, would probably just say environmental movements are able to garner for change through disruptive like protests that force the government to listen to them. So that's just listing like protests as a mechanism. A stronger team will explain how the protests look like and why the protest is going to succeed against the government. So for example, a stronger team would say, environmental movements have also engaged in very disruptive protests in forcing the government to change their policies. We could see this when we look at Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion that actively encourages students from all across the world to like drop out of school and go onto the streets to demand that the government listen to their pleas with regards to environmental change. Or the fact that protests can actively hurt the economic activity within a country. So for example, if you look at Hong Kong protesters actively protested within like economic regions or within like areas where there were like huge economic activities. So they went to the airports, they actively like protest on like the air lanes so that planes are not able to land. They went to like the rich business street in Hong Kong so that they are able to actively protest there so that people, so that the government would feel the hurt of their economic activity being disrupted. So if you listen to the former and you listen to the latter is a lot more persuasive because you're explaining to the judge how this mechanism is going to work and why this mechanism is likely to succeed. So this basically answers the question as to how do you prove why those mechanisms will result in the solution that you envision within the round. So hopefully this answered the question with regards to what exactly is a mechanism and how exactly do you identify a premise. The last question that I want to answer is how do you determine the most important issue to solve in the motion from the Q&A list I have. I think the last thing that I would have to say here is that if you like, there's no hard and fast rule as to how to determine the most important like issue in the round. I do think like this comes with experience, and that it's basically a trial and error process. So like the first few times, like you might not get what is the most important issue in the round, but as it goes on, hopefully it gets easier for you. All right, I'm done with a lot of the questions that were from the Q&A segment. So now I would quickly take questions from the floor if there's any.
If you have a question, what you can do is you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you, and after that you can just voice the question. We'll be taking questions till about 4:55 and then we'll have to wrap up from there. Oh, sorry, I meant 3:55, not 4:55. Right, we'll be wrapping up at about 3:55. but we might end earlier if no one has any questions that they would like to raise. You can raise any of the questions right now. I'm going to just give you permission to unmute yourself, so you can just go ahead and do it if you want to. Any questions?
I have a question. So let's say if we want to include feasibility as part of our argument construction, under which tier would it go under? Or do we need to have a new tier on its own for that?
All right. Okay. So I think like feasibility as a discussion for any motion. Okay. So the first thing I want to be clear is I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the term like prop fiat or proposition fiat. So if let's say a motion is about this house will abolish the Olympics, any opposition team that runs an argument to say that it is not feasible for you to abolish the Olympics, is not an argument that will win them the debate. And the reason for it is because the motion assumes that proposition can defend the abolishment of the Olympics. So feasibility is not usually a problem in most debates, or at least in motions that explicitly calls for you to do a particular action or to enact a particular model or policy. But let's say if it's a motion about this house believe that the climate change movement has done more good than harm, and you're defending, let's say, engaging in policies of like campaigns and like protests, then yes, you will need to prove the feasibility of a campaign and a protest succeeding. So it's not really feasibility per se, it's more of a likelihood analysis. So it is the tier immediately after explaining the mechanism, right? So let's say I explain the mechanism as to why campaigns and protests would work, both in raising awareness as well as disrupting important governmental infrastructure. I would then move on to the likelihood as to why both campaigns and why protests are likely to succeed in the vast majority of instances. Because you could very well get an opposition to say that campaigns are not likely to succeed because people have very little interest in listening to environmental groups or like tree-hugging liberals when they don't actually explain the consequences of what the environmental devastation looks like. Or you could get an opposition that say like protests are not successful because governments can actively clamp down on it. So after you explain the mechanism on proposition, to preempt what opposition would say in response, you want to explain the likelihood of your policy succeeding. So you want to explain why is it likely that that policies or processes of campaigns and protests would succeed in the vast majority of cases, and why even if there's some government opposition or a government that opposition talks about that will clamp down on this movement, why they would still succeed in spite of the government clampdown. So this is probably more in line with explaining why the policy is feasible, or like the action that you want to take is feasible or more likely. You would insert this as a tier of analysis right after you explain the mechanism as to how you want to create change within the society or within the movement or within the motion that you're talking about. So hopefully this answers the question that you have.
Okay, so for feasibility, it will be generally the format will be something like this policy is say feasible because it is, I don't know, easy to carry out or impact people on a greater level. So it has a greater chance of succeeding.
Yeah. So the first thing is, as I said, right, if the motion explicitly calls you to defend a policy, feasibility is not really a problem if the motion explicitly forces you to defend a policy, right? So if the motion is like, this house would ban smoking in public areas or public spaces, an opposition team that says that you cannot ban it in public spaces means that there's no debate, right? So feasibility doesn't become an area of concern because you would, like the motion already like demands that proposition would envision a world where people can no longer smoke in public spaces. Feasibility only ever becomes an issue when the motion doesn't explicitly requires you to defend a policy, and you need to defend why this measure would work. So for instance, if the motion says this house would set up an international organization to oversee international crimes or international drug trafficking, a proposition can fiat to say that they can establish an international system that would oversee the international trafficking of drugs, but proposition cannot fiat that this model would be successful. So they would have to prove the feasibility, or they would have to prove the likelihood of success with regards to establishing a global institution that will oversee like global trafficking of drugs, or like the global drug problems. Yeah. All right, any other questions? I'll take one last question from the floor. If none, then.
All right, if there are no more questions, I think we can conclude today's session for case construction and preparation technique. We would like to thank Farhan very much for that very informative and example-loaded lecture. I think this is what's needed, especially since a lot of kids in the circuit are asking questions about what do you do when you come across a motion that you don't know anything about, or thinking about what kind of arguments run, what's the train of thought to go through before you get to that argument, how to distill that argument and those conclusions that you want to powerfully win the debate. Thank you so much, Farhan.
Thank you. Hope
right.
all of you like learned something from this case preparation like session, and that it was effective and useful for you. My suggestion to like younger debaters is like, don't be afraid to ask like senior debaters within like the debating circuit. Like a lot of us are more than happy to help you out with regards to any questions that you have. And also like the debate association is there for a reason. Like if you need help, like do feel free to approach like any one of the members of the debate association. They are incredibly efficient and they are like incredibly effective at what they are doing in promoting debating in Singapore. So I hope everyone had a good time. I had a good time answering your questions. And hopefully I would see you at the WSDC tournament. I hope all of you sign up. That tournament would hopefully be a great way for you to put everything you've learned from the various debate lectures into practice. All right, see all of you soon.
Remember to follow our Instagram page. It's new at Debate Association Singapore. Yeah, it's literally just at Debate Association Singapore. Follow it for updates and promotions and all of that, because apparently you guys don't use Facebook anymore. So, all right. Thank you very much for coming. Please make sure that you come on time tomorrow. When you come for the lecture, come at 9:40 a.m. and wait in the waiting room so that we can approve you and admit you into the call. So thank you very much for coming today, and thank you very much for supporting our event. We would like to end day one on a high note. Thank you very much, everyone, for being cooperative, and we'll see you tomorrow.